I found the email from Sharon Whitmore, HOA board president, sitting in my mailbox on a Tuesday afternoon in Phoenix, Arizona. And something about the way she phrased mandatory attendance strongly encouraged made my stomach drop. The annual meeting was scheduled for next Friday at 7 in the evening at the Saguaro Vista Community Center. And I had lived in this sprawling suburban development for 3 years without paying much attention to HOA politics. My wife Jennifer and I bought our 4-bedroom house here in 2023, drawn by the pristine landscaping, 2 pools, and the promise of a well-maintained neighborhood. We paid our quarterly dues of $850 without complaint, trusted the board to handle things professionally, and went about our lives. I worked as a software engineer for a tech company downtown. Jennifer taught 3rd grade at a nearby elementary school, and we had 2 kids, Emma and Jack, aged 7 and 5. Life was comfortable, predictable, and exactly what we wanted when we left our cramped apartment in Tempe. But over the past 6 months, something had shifted in Saguaro Vista. The tone of Sharon's emails had become increasingly aggressive. Fines were being issued for minor infractions like trash cans left out an hour past pickup time. And several neighbors had mentioned receiving violation notices for things that seemed absurdly petty. My friend Carlos Rodriguez, who lived 4 houses down, got fined $200 because his house numbers were the wrong shade of bronze. Another neighbor, Beth Patterson, received a violation for having a decorative garden gnome that apparently violated the aesthetic standards outlined in some obscure subsection of our CCRs. I showed Jennifer the email that evening while she was making dinner. She read it over my shoulder, her brow furrowing. Mandatory attendance strongly encouraged. That doesn't even make grammatical sense. I know, and look at this line here about discussing important financial decisions and community investments. Jennifer stirred the pasta sauce, her wedding ring clinking against the wooden spoon. Do you think something's wrong with the budget? I don't know, but I'm going to that meeting. Want to come with me? She nodded. My mom can watch the kids. I wouldn't miss this for anything. Sandra from my yoga class said the board has been acting really weird lately. Apparently they had some kind of closed-door meeting last month that wasn't announced to residents. The week crawled by, and I found myself paying more attention to the neighborhood dynamics than I ever had before. On Wednesday morning, I ran into Carlos while getting my mail. He was a stocky guy in his 40s with graying hair and a perpetually friendly demeanor, but today he looked stressed. You going to the meeting Friday? He asked. Absolutely. You. Wouldn't miss it. My wife Maria has been tracking the HOA finances because something seemed off about the last quarterly report. The numbers didn't add up right. What do you mean? Carlos glanced around as if checking for eavesdroppers, which seemed paranoid until I remembered that Sharon lived just 2 streets over. The operating expenses were way higher than they should have been. Like, we have a landscaping contract for $12,000 a month, right? That's been consistent for years. But last quarter, landscaping expenses were listed at $18,000 per month with no explanation. Did you ask about it? Maria sent 3 emails to Sharon, never got a response. Then she tried to request access to the detailed financial records, which we're legally entitled to see as homeowners, and Sharon said they were being audited and weren't available. A cold feeling settled in my chest. That's not normal. No, it's not. And get this, Beth told me that her husband Jim tried to attend a board meeting last month, you know. They're supposed to be open to all residents, and Sharon told him it was a special executive session and he couldn't come in. But there was nothing on the website about it being executive session. I spent the next 2 days doing research. I pulled up our HOA's governing documents, which I probably should have read more carefully before buying the house, and learned that board members were supposed to act as fiduciaries for the community. They had a legal obligation to manage our funds responsibly and transparently. I also discovered that Arizona law required HOAs to make financial records available to homeowners within 10 business days of a written request, and that board meetings had to follow specific rules about public notice and attendance. By Friday afternoon, I was wired with nervous energy. Jennifer came home from school early, and we grabbed a quick dinner before heading to the community center. The sun was setting over the desert mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful if I wasn't so anxious about what the evening might bring. The parking lot was completely full when we arrived 15 minutes early. Cars lined the side streets, and residents were streaming toward the building entrance with expressions that ranged from curious to openly hostile. I recognized most of them by sight. We had a community of about 250 homes, so you got to know faces even if you didn't know names. Inside, the main hall had been set up with rows of folding chairs facing a long table at the front where the board members would sit. Every seat was taken, and people were standing along the walls. The air conditioning struggled against the body heat of probably 300 residents, packed into a space meant for half that number. I counted quickly and realized that this had to be nearly every homeowner in Sagaro Vista. You never got this kind of turnout for annual meetings. Jennifer and I found a spot against the back wall near Carlos and Maria. She was a petite woman with sharp eyes and an accountant's attention to detail. She held a thick folder of papers. "You brought documentation?" I asked. Maria patted the folder. 12 months of financial records that I managed to piece together from quarterly reports, plus comparable data from other HOAs in the Phoenix area. If they try to gaslight us about what's normal spending, I've got receipts. At exactly 7 o'clock, the 5 board members filed in through a side door. Sharon Whitmore led the way, and I got my first good look at her in months. She was in her mid-50s with carefully highlighted blonde hair styled in that specific suburban mom cut that never seemed to go out of fashion. She wore a cream-colored blazer over a floral blouse and carried herself with the air of someone who believed deeply in her own authority. Behind her came the other board members. Patricia Henderson, the vice president, a tall woman with angular features and an expression like she smelled something bad. Mark Davidson, the treasurer, a nervous-looking man in his 60s who kept adjusting his glasses. Linda Chen, the secretary, who seemed pleasant enough and actually waved at a few people in the crowd. And Robert Morrison, a member-at-large who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Sharon took her seat at the center of the table, arranged her papers with precise movements, and smiled at the assembled crowd. It was not a warm smile. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for attending our annual community meeting. We have a lot to cover tonight, so let's get started with the formalities." She launched into a reading of the previous meeting's minutes, her voice taking on that particular cadence of someone who loved the sound of their own authority. Most of the crowd shifted restlessly. People hadn't come here for parliamentary procedure. After 10 minutes of bureaucratic recitation, Sharon finally said, "Now, moving on to the financial report. Mark, would you like to present?" Mark Davidson cleared his throat and stood up, fumbling with a small stack of papers. "Yes, well, the financial state of Sagaro Vista is strong. We ended the fiscal year with approximately $43,000 in our reserve fund, which is below our target of $100,000, but we've implemented several cost-saving measures and new revenue streams that should help us reach our goals." "What new revenue streams?" Someone called out from the middle of the room. I recognized the voice as belonging to James Chen, Linda's husband. Sharon's smile tightened. "We'll get to questions after the presentation, James. Please hold all comments until the appropriate time." Mark continued, his voice shaky. "Our total income from dues was $765,000. Operating expenses were $692,000. The major expense categories included landscaping, pool maintenance, insurance, utilities for common areas, and administrative costs. Maria raised her hand, but Sharon ignored her. Mark sat down quickly, looking relieved to be done. "Any questions about the financial report?" Sharon asked, but her tone suggested she hoped there wouldn't be any. At least 20 hands shot up. Sharon's expression went from annoyed to openly hostile. "Let's keep this orderly. One at a time. Yes, Tom." Tom Brennan, a retired firefighter who lived near the north entrance, stood up. He was a big guy with a white beard and the kind of presence that commanded attention. "Sharon, I'd like to know why the administrative costs more than doubled from the previous year. We went from 32,000 to 78,000. What changed?" The room went dead silent. Sharon's jaw tightened. Administrative costs include a variety of expenses related to running the community. Legal fees, accounting services, software subscriptions, office supplies, and compensation for board members. The last part landed like a bomb. Conversation erupted instantly, dozens of people talking at once. I felt Jennifer grab my arm. "Compensation?" Tom's voice cut through the noise. "Board members are volunteers. That's how HOAs work. We don't pay board members." Sharon stood up, her hands flat on the table. "If everyone would please calm down, I can explain. The board voted earlier this year to implement a modest compensation structure to recognize the significant time and effort that goes into managing a community of this size. We're talking about countless hours of work, dealing with resident complaints, vendors, legal issues, and strategic planning." "How modest?" Maria called out, her voice sharp. Patricia Henderson leaned toward her microphone. "I don't think we need to get into specific numbers. The point is that the compensation is reasonable and comparable to other communities." "The hell it is," Maria shot back, opening her folder. "I've researched 23 HOAs in the Phoenix metro area of similar size. Exactly 2 of them pay board members, and in both cases, it's a small stipend of $500 per year for the president only. So either tell us the real numbers, or I'm going to submit a formal records request first thing Monday morning, which you're legally required to fulfill within 10 days. The room erupted again, this time with cheers and applause. Sharon's face flushed red. She wasn't used to being challenged, and certainly not in front of the entire community. Mark Davidson looked like he might be sick. He leaned over to whisper something to Sharon, but she waved him off angrily. "Fine. You want transparency." The board voted to implement a compensation structure that provides each board member with $16,000 annually, paid quarterly. The math hit everyone at the same moment. 5 board members times $16,000 equaled $80,000. The administrative costs had jumped by roughly that exact amount. The noise level became deafening. People were shouting, some were standing, and I saw at least 3 people with their phones out recording video. Jennifer looked at me with wide eyes. They gave themselves $80,000. "Of our money," Carlos was yelling in Spanish, a mix of profanity and outrage that I didn't need to translate to understand. Maria was furiously taking notes. Tom Brennan looked ready to flip the table. Sharon was banging a gavel that she'd apparently brought for exactly this purpose, the sharp cracks barely audible over the chaos. "Order. We will have order. This is still an official meeting and we will conduct ourselves appropriately. You stole from us," someone screamed. I couldn't see who. "We most certainly did not," Patricia Henderson snapped into her microphone. "Every action we took was legal and within the board's authority to manage compensation structures. If you people actually read the governing documents, you'd know that the board has discretionary authority over administrative budgets." "Discretionary authority doesn't mean you can rob us blind," Tom shot back. "You're supposed to be serving the community, not lining your pockets." Robert Morrison, who had been silent until now, suddenly stood up and pushed his chair back. "I'm done. I voted against this and I told all of you it was wrong." He looked at Sharon with disgust. "I resign, effective immediately." Then he walked out the side door, leaving his 4 colleagues staring after him. The crowd erupted in applause. Whatever control Sharon had over the meeting evaporated completely. People were crowding toward the front table, voices overlapping in anger and accusation. I saw our neighbor Beth recording everything on her phone, while her husband Jim shouted questions about whether the board had filed proper tax documents for the compensation. Jennifer tugged my arm. "We should get closer. I want to hear everything." We pushed through the crowd, working our way toward the front. I could see Sharon's face clearly now, and she looked furious but also scared. She hadn't expected this level of organized resistance. Patricia was arguing with someone about fiduciary duty. Linda Chen was crying. Mark Davidson had actually put his head down on the table. Maria somehow made it to the very front of the room and slammed her folder down on the table with a bang that got everyone's attention. "I want to know exactly when this vote happened, who voted for it, and whether you followed proper procedures for board meetings. Because I've been monitoring the community website, and I don't see any meeting minutes from any session where compensation was discussed. That means either you didn't keep minutes, which is illegal, or you had a secret meeting, which is also illegal." Sharon's eyes narrowed. "That was discussed in executive session, which is allowed under." "Executive session is only allowed for specific purposes," Maria interrupted. "Personnel matters, legal issues, or contract negotiations. Voting to pay yourselves doesn't fall under any of those categories. That's general business that requires a public meeting with proper notice." "She's right," someone called out. I turned and saw it was David Park, an attorney who lived in the southern section of the development. He pushed forward through the crowd. "I'm a lawyer specializing in real estate and corporate governance. What you did is a clear violation of Arizona HOA law. Board compensation of this magnitude would require amendment of the governing documents, which means a vote of the homeowners. You can't just decide to pay yourselves $16,000 each." The energy in the room shifted from chaotic anger to focused fury. People weren't just mad anymore, they smelled blood in the water. Sharon tried to rally. "The board consulted with our attorney who assured us that." "Who's your attorney?" David asked sharply. "Gregory Simmons at Parker and Associates." David pulled out his phone, tapped for a moment, then looked up with an expression of disbelief. "Gregory Simmons was disbarred in Arizona 3 months ago for misappropriation of client funds. He can't practice law in this state. Who have you been getting legal advice from?" The silence that followed was absolute. Sharon's face went from red to white. Patricia Henderson stood up so fast her chair tipped over. "That's not possible. We just spoke to him last month about." She stopped abruptly, seeming to realize that finishing that sentence would make things worse. "You've been taking legal advice from a disbarred attorney." Tom Brennan's voice was dangerously quiet. "For how long?" No one on the board answered. Linda Chen was openly sobbing now. Mark Davidson looked catatonic. Jennifer leaned close to me. "This is insane. This is actually insane." Carlos appeared at my elbow. "This is criminal. They're going to jail." I wasn't sure about that, but I was sure that this had gone way beyond HOA drama into something much more serious. Around us, people were making phone calls. I heard multiple people saying things like, "You need to get down here right now, and you're not going to believe what's happening." David Park was still at the front, now having a heated conversation with Maria and Tom and several other residents. After a moment, he turned to face the crowd and raised his voice. "Can I have everyone's attention? As a legal professional, I'm advising everyone here that we need to take several immediate steps. First, we need to call an emergency meeting to remove the current board members. Second, we need to secure all financial records and documents before anything disappears. Third, we should probably contact the Arizona Attorney General's office and report potential fraud. I'll call the police right now, Beth's husband Jim said, phone already in hand. Sharon found her voice. You can't call the police. We haven't done anything criminal. This is a civil matter. You took $80,000 of community funds under false pretenses based on advice from a disbarred attorney, David countered. That's fraud and possibly embezzlement. These people absolutely can and should call the police. Patricia Henderson grabbed her purse from behind the table. I'm not staying for this circus. Sit down, Tom Brennan commanded, moving to block the side door. Nobody's leaving until we sort this out. You can't hold us here, Patricia protested, but she didn't try to push past him. Jim was talking to a 911 dispatcher, explaining the situation. I could only hear his side of the conversation, but it was clear the dispatcher was taking it seriously. White-collar crime was still crime, especially when it involved hundreds of thousands of dollars in community assets. The next 20 minutes were a blur of activity. More residents kept arriving as word spread through text messages and phone calls. The crowd swelled until people were packed into the hallway outside. Someone had the presence of mind to live stream the meeting on the community Facebook page, and I later learned that over 400 people tuned in to watch. Maria and David organized an impromptu committee to start documenting everything. They collected contact information from witnesses, made copies of Maria's research, and started building a timeline of suspicious activities. Jennifer joined them, her teacher's organizational skills proving invaluable for keeping track of who knew what and when. 2 Phoenix police officers arrived around 8:30, their presence immediately commanding attention. The older one, Officer Rodriguez, no relation to my friend Carlos, looked around the packed room with an expression of weary professionalism. All right, someone want to explain what's going on here. Everyone tried to talk at once. Officer Rodriguez held up a hand. One person, you, sir, in the plaid shirt, give me the short version. Tom Brennan stepped forward and laid it out concisely. The board had secretly voted themselves $80,000 in bonuses. They claimed legal authority based on advice from a disbarred attorney. Residents had no knowledge of the compensation until tonight. Multiple violations of HOA law and possibly fraud. Officer Rodriguez looked at his partner, a younger woman named Officer Santos, and something passed between them. We're going to need to see financial documents, Rodriguez said. And we'll need statements from the board members. Sharon had regained some composure. We're happy to cooperate with law enforcement, but I want to make it clear that we acted in good faith based on legal counsel. If that counsel was faulty, we're victims too. That's for investigators to determine, Officer Santos said, but I'm going to need you and the other board members to come down to the station for formal statements. Are we being arrested? Patricia asked, her voice shrill. Not at this time, but this is a serious allegation and we need official statements. You can come voluntarily or we can do this the hard way. Sharon looked like she wanted to argue, but even she could read the room well enough to know that resistance would make everything worse. Fine, we'll come voluntarily, but I want to call my attorney. That's your right, Officer Rodriguez said, though you might want to make sure this one is actually licensed to practice law. The burn landed hard. A ripple of grim laughter went through the crowd. The board members gathered their belongings under the watchful eyes of 300 residents. As they filed out toward the police cars, people shouted questions and accusations. I heard someone yell about the trash, fines, and ridiculous violations. Someone else brought up how Sharon had forced a couple to remove their vegetable garden last year. because it wasn't aesthetically appropriate. After the board left, the energy in the room remained electric. David Park stood at the front table and called for order. "Okay, everyone, we need to organize this properly. According to our bylaws, if the board is unable to perform their duties, the homeowners can call an emergency election. I propose we do that tonight." "All in favor," Tom Brennan called out. A forest of hands shot up, accompanied by a chorus of affirmative shouts. It was possibly the most unified I'd ever seen any group of people. "Motion passes," David said with a slight smile. "Now we need nominations for an interim board. We need 5 people who are willing to serve, and I strongly suggest we choose people with relevant expertise. Finance, legal, property management, that sort of thing." Maria was nominated immediately and accepted. Tom Brennan agreed to serve as president. David Park took the role of legal advisor, though technically, he couldn't be on the board due to conflict of interest if legal action proceeded. A woman named Sarah Johnson, who owned a property management company, volunteered for vice president. A retired accountant named Henry Wu accepted the treasurer position. And Linda Chen's husband James, who actually seemed reasonable despite his wife's involvement in the scandal, agreed to be secretary after making it clear he had no knowledge of the board's actions and was as blindsided as everyone else. We held an immediate vote by show of hands, and the interim board was approved unanimously. The whole process took about 45 minutes and was probably the fastest election in HOA history. The new board's first action was to freeze all HOA accounts pending a full audit. Sarah Johnson knew a forensic accountant who specialized in fraud cases. Henry Wu started pulling together every financial document he could access through the online portal. Tom appointed committees to handle immediate concerns: pool maintenance, landscaping contracts, and resident communications. It was nearly midnight when Jennifer and I finally left the community center. My head was spinning from everything that had happened. In the space of 5 hours, we'd uncovered massive financial fraud, seen a board implode, and participated in an emergency election. It was the kind of drama you'd expect from a reality TV show, not a suburban Phoenix HOA. "I can't believe they thought they'd get away with it," Jennifer said as we drove home. $80,000, how stupid do you have to be? "I think they got used to no one paying attention," I said. "They've been doing whatever they wanted for so long that they forgot they were accountable to us." "Well, they're going to find out about accountability now." The next few days were intense. The story hit local news when someone shared the live stream video with a reporter at the Phoenix New-Times. By Monday morning, Sagaro Vista HOA scandal was trending on local social media. News vans showed up in the neighborhood, interviewing residents and capturing footage of the manicured lawns and pristine common areas that our misappropriated funds had presumably helped maintain. The forensic accountant, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Lee, started her audit on Monday afternoon. What she found was worse than anyone had expected. The $80,000 in bonuses was just the tip of the iceberg. Over the past 2 years, Sharon and Patricia Henderson had been submitting fake invoices for services never rendered. They had a shell company called Desert Property Services that supposedly handled special maintenance projects. Except Desert Property Services was just Sharon's nephew, and the only maintenance he'd done was occasionally pressure washing his aunt's driveway. Maria's digging had uncovered about $28,000 in fraudulent charges. Patricia Lee found another $67,000. Combined with the bonuses, we were looking at close to $175,000 in stolen or misappropriated funds. Henry Wu called an emergency board meeting for Wednesday evening, properly noticed this time with 48 hours advance notice posted in multiple locations. The community center was packed again, though this time there was grim satisfaction in the air rather than chaotic anger. We knew what had happened. Now we wanted justice. Tom Brennan stood at the front table with Maria and the other new board members. Thank you all for coming. I wish I had better news, but Patricia Lee has completed her preliminary audit and the findings are serious. Very serious. He laid out the numbers. The room was silent except for the rustle of papers and the occasional sharp intake of breath. $175,000. It was staggering. We've filed a formal complaint with the Arizona Attorney General's office, Tom continued. We've also hired a law firm that specializes in HOA litigation to pursue civil recovery of the stolen funds. The police investigation is ongoing, and we expect criminal charges to be filed within the next week or two. What about our reserve fund? Someone asked. Can we recover from this? Henry Wu took over. Our reserve fund is essentially depleted. We have about $14,000 left, which is critically low for a community our size. We should have at least $100,000 in reserves for emergency repairs and capital improvements. The good news is that if we successfully recover the stolen funds through civil litigation, we can rebuild the reserves. The bad news is that litigation takes time, and we may need to implement a special assessment to cover immediate shortfalls. Groans rippled through the crowd. Nobody wanted to pay more money, especially after being robbed, but the math was simple. A community our size needed operating capital, and ours had been looted. Sarah Johnson outlined a plan for a special assessment of $500 per household, paid over 6 months. It wasn't ideal, but it was manageable and would give us enough cushion to operate while the legal process played out. The vote was close. Nobody was happy about it, but it passed with about 60% approval. I voted yes despite my reservations. We needed functional pools and landscaping, and the alternative was letting everything fall apart while we waited for the courts to maybe recover our money. Jennifer agreed, though she pointed out the bitter irony of paying more money to fix problems caused by the people we'd trusted to manage our money in the first place. The police investigation moved faster than I expected. Detective Sarah Morrison, no relation to the former board member Robert Morrison, was assigned to the case, and she was thorough. She interviewed dozens of residents, subpoenaed bank records, and traced the money flow through Sharon's shell company. The fake invoices were obvious once someone looked closely. Most of them were for services allegedly performed on dates, when contractors' calendars showed they were working other jobs across the city. Some invoices were for amounts just under the threshold that required board approval, a classic sign of deliberate fraud. On a Thursday morning in early October, 3 weeks after the infamous annual meeting, Detective Morrison arrived at Sharon Whitmore's house with an arrest warrant. The charges included fraud, embezzlement, theft, and falsifying records. Patricia Henderson was arrested the same morning. Mark Davidson was charged as an accessory for signing off on fraudulent financial reports, even though he claimed he'd been misled by Sharon. Linda Chen avoided criminal charges by agreeing to cooperate fully with prosecutors and testifying against the others. I watched the news coverage that evening with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Sharon being led out of her house in handcuffs should have felt like pure victory, but mostly it just felt pathetic. This woman had destroyed her reputation, her freedom, and her financial future for $80,000, and the petty power trip of running an HOA like her personal fiefdom. The legal process ground forward with agonizing slowness. Criminal trials were scheduled for the following spring. The HOA's civil lawsuit moved even slower, with lawyers filing motions and countermotions and engaging in the kind of procedural warfare that probably cost us another $20,000 in legal fees. Meanwhile, the new board worked to stabilize the community. Tom Brennan proved to be an excellent president, combining natural leadership with a total lack of patience for nonsense. When a vendor tried to overcharge for pool chemicals, Tom negotiated aggressively and got the price down. When residents complained about new rules requiring proper documentation for architectural changes, Tom explained clearly why documentation protected everyone and prevented future disputes. Maria revolutionized the financial reporting system. Monthly financial statements were posted online with detailed breakdowns of every expense. Quarterly town halls gave residents opportunities to ask questions and raise concerns. The transparency was refreshing after years of Sharon's secretive control. I got more involved in community affairs than I'd ever planned. Tom asked me to chair a technology committee to improve the HOA website and implement better communication tools. It was volunteer work, no compensation involved, which was how it should have been all along. Jennifer joined the landscaping committee and helped redesign some common areas to use more native desert plants that required less water and maintenance. Carlos and Maria became close friends of ours. We had dinner together weekly, and our kids played together constantly. The scandal had shaken the community, but it also brought people together in unexpected ways. We'd learned that participation mattered, that paying attention mattered, and that blind trust in authority figures was a recipe for disaster. The criminal trial for Sharon Whitmore and Patricia Henderson finally began in April. Jennifer and I attended several days of testimony. It was surreal watching Sharon sit at the defense table in a conservative Navy suit, looking nothing like the imperious HOA president who'd ruled over community meetings. She'd lost weight, and her hair had gone gray at the roots. Her lawyer mounted a defense claiming she'd believed she was acting within her authority based on legal advice from Gregory Simmons, but the prosecution systematically demolished that argument. Detective Morrison testified about the fake invoices and shell company. The paper trail was damning. Patricia Lee walked the jury through the forensic accounting, showing exactly how money had been diverted and hidden. Maria testified about being stonewalled when she requested financial records. Tom Brennan described the annual meeting and the board's reaction when confronted. The most devastating testimony came from Robert Morrison, the former board member who'd resigned during the meeting. He testified that Sharon had pressured the board to approve the bonuses, claiming that other HOAs paid their boards and that they deserved compensation for their time. When he'd objected, Sharon had berated him privately and threatened to make his life in the community miserable. He'd voted no on the compensation but had been outvoted 4-1. Did Miss Whitmore ever mention that the legal advice justifying these bonuses came from Gregory Simmons? The prosecutor asked. Yes, she cited him constantly. Said he'd reviewed everything and it was all legal. Did she tell you that Mr. Simmons had been disbarred? No, I learned that at the annual meeting along with everyone else. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, guilty on all counts for both Sharon and Patricia. Mark Davidson took a plea deal earlier, agreeing to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence. He ended up with 2 years probation and community service. Sharon Whitmore was sentenced to 3 years in state prison with the possibility of parole after 18 months. She was also ordered to pay full restitution of $175,000, split between her and Patricia Henderson, who received a similar sentence. The judge made pointed comments about betrayal of trust and abuse of fiduciary duty. I felt a grim satisfaction watching Sharon's face as the sentence was read. She'd gotten exactly what she deserved. The civil case settled shortly after the criminal convictions. Sharon's homeowner's insurance covered part of the liability, and the rest would come from seizing assets. We'd eventually recover about 80% of the stolen funds, which was better than many fraud victims managed. The settlement took another 6 months to finalize, but by December, the HOA received a check for $140,000. The December board meeting was almost festive. Tom announced the settlement, and people actually applauded. Henry Wu presented a revised budget showing that with the recovered funds and the special assessment, we'd rebuild our reserves to healthy levels within 2 years. Maria outlined new policies for financial oversight, including mandatory annual audits and term limits for board members. "I want to make sure this never happens again," Maria said. "We're implementing checks and balances. No single person will have unilateral control over finances. All expenditures over $500 require 2 signatures. Board meetings will be recorded and posted online. And we're going to actively encourage resident participation in committees and oversight roles." Sarah Johnson added, "We're also partnering with other HOAs in the Phoenix area to share best practices and create educational resources. A lot of communities have similar problems with board overreach and financial mismanagement. We can help prevent that by sharing what we learned." I raised my hand. "I have a suggestion. What if we create an annual award or recognition for the most engaged residents? Something to encourage participation and remind everyone that this is our community, not the board's private kingdom." Jennifer smiled at me from across the room. Tom nodded thoughtfully. "I like that. Let's develop that idea. Anyone interested in forming a committee?" Several hands went up. The energy in the room was positive, constructive, and completely different from the chaos of that infamous annual meeting 13 months earlier. As we left the community center that night, Jennifer took my hand. The December air was cool and comfortable, perfect Arizona winter weather. Our neighborhood looked beautiful under the street lights, the desert landscaping professionally maintained, the houses glowing with Christmas decorations. "You know what's crazy?" Jennifer said. "I'm actually glad this happened." I looked at her in surprise. "Glad we were robbed." "No, glad we found out. Glad we did something about it." Think about how many communities have corrupt boards that never get caught, or get caught but nobody cares enough to fix it. We could have just shrugged and moved on and let them keep stealing. Instead, we organized, we fought back, and we made real change. She was right. The scandal had been terrible, but our response to it had been remarkable. A community that barely knew each other had come together, held criminals accountable, and built something better than what we'd started with. Plus, Jennifer added with a grin, you have to admit that annual meeting was the most exciting thing that's happened to us since we moved here. I laughed. I could do with a little less excitement, honestly. Oh, come on, you loved every minute of it. I saw you taking notes and researching HOA law at midnight. You were in your element. She knew me too well. There had been something deeply satisfying about the whole process, from uncovering the fraud to organizing the response to watching justice get served. Maybe it was the engineer in me that loved solving complex problems. Maybe it was just basic human satisfaction at seeing wrongdoing punished. We walked home slowly, enjoying the evening. Carlos waved from his driveway where he was helping his kids practice basketball. Beth and Jim drove past, honking cheerfully. The sense of community was tangible in a way it had never been before the scandal. The following year brought continued stability and improvement. Tom Brennan served his full term and then stepped down, citing work commitments. Maria ran for president and won easily. The board she assembled was competent, transparent, and committed to serving rather than ruling. Quarterly dues stayed stable. The pools got resurfaced. The landscaping improved with the native plant redesign saving thousands in water costs. Sharon Whitmore's house sat empty for months until the bank finally foreclosed. A young family bought it at auction and moved in with no knowledge of the history. I felt a little bad for them. They'd probably figure out eventually that they lived in the infamous house. But they seemed nice, and their kids immediately made friends with other children in the neighborhood. Patricia Henderson's house went through a similar process. The new owners were a retired couple from Minnesota who were thrilled with the Phoenix weather and the community amenities. They joined several committees and became active participants in HOA affairs, which felt like poetic justice. I stayed involved with the technology committee and ended up helping several other HOAs in the area implement better communication systems. It became a weird hobby, this HOA advocacy work, but it felt meaningful. We were helping communities function better and preventing the kind of abuse of power that had infected Sagaro Vista. Jennifer eventually wrote an article about the experience for a local parenting magazine, focusing on the importance of community engagement and teaching children about civic responsibility. She used it as a lesson plan in her classroom, helping third graders understand how communities work and why participation matters. Emma and Jack grew up knowing the story, and I like to think they learned something valuable about standing up for what's right. 2 years after the scandal, I found myself standing at that same community center for another annual meeting. This time, the crowd was smaller, maybe 75 people instead of 300, but the atmosphere was completely different. People chatted pleasantly, kids ran around the edges of the room, and the board members greeted residents warmly as they arrived. Maria called the meeting to order right at 7. She presented the financial report, which showed healthy reserves, balanced budgets, and responsible spending. Henry Wu, still serving as treasurer, highlighted several successful cost-saving initiatives. Sarah Johnson reported on property maintenance and improvements. The whole presentation took 30 minutes, and there wasn't a single raised voice or angry question. At the end, Tom Brennan stood up for the homeowner comment period. I just want to say how proud I am of this community. 3 years ago, we went through something terrible, but we responded with integrity, accountability, and determination to build something better. Look at us now. We have transparent finances, engaged residents, and a board that actually serves the community. We did this together, and we should all be proud. The room erupted in applause. It felt good, clean, and simple. We'd been tested and we'd passed. The scandal that could have destroyed our community had instead made it stronger. As the meeting wrapped up, I caught Maria's eye and gave her a thumbs up. She smiled and mouthed, "Thank you." All of us who'd been there from the beginning shared that connection, that knowledge of what we'd overcome together. Jennifer and I walked home for the last time from a Sagaro Vista annual meeting. We were moving to Seattle in 2 months for my job, leaving behind the house we'd loved and the community we'd fought for. It was bittersweet, but I felt good about the timing. The community was stable, healthy, and in good hands. Our work here was done. "You're going to miss this," Jennifer said, reading my thoughts. "Yeah, I am, but Seattle has HOAs too. Maybe we'll find another scandal to uncover." She laughed and shoved my shoulder. "Don't even joke about that. I want our next HOA to be boring and functional. Where's the fun in that?" But secretly, I hoped she was right. Once in a lifetime was enough for HOA drama. Then again, if it happened, at least I knew what to do about it. I knew how to organize, how to research, how to rally people around a common cause. I knew that transparency and accountability mattered, that participation wasn't optional, and that ordinary people could make extraordinary change when they decided to act. The lights were on in our house as we approached. Emma and Jack were visible through the front window, probably supposed to be in bed but definitely still awake. The desert landscape around us was peaceful under the starlight. Our HOA dues had helped maintain the pristine appearance of Sagaro Vista, and for once, I knew exactly where every dollar had gone and what it had accomplished. That knowledge, that certainty, was worth everything we'd fought for. Sharon Whitmore had tried to turn our community into her personal piggy bank, and she'd paid the price. Justice had been served, systems had been fixed, and life had gone on. In the end, that's all you could ask for: accountability, fairness, and the chance to build something better than what came before. I looked back at the community center one last time before we went inside. The building was dark now, the parking lot empty. In a few weeks, another board meeting would happen, and residents would gather to discuss landscaping and pool schedules and all the mundane details that make a community function. And maybe, just maybe, they'd remember the lessons learned from one dramatic annual meeting when everything changed. Because that's how it works. You show up, you pay attention, you hold people accountable, and you never assume that someone else will handle things. Democracy, even HOA democracy, requires participation. It requires vigilance. It requires ordinary people deciding that they give a damn about where they live and who's making decisions on their behalf. Sharon Whitmore had forgotten that. She'd assumed we wouldn't notice, wouldn't care, wouldn't organize. She'd been spectacularly wrong, and her mistake had cost her everything. Meanwhile, we'd gained something precious: a functional, transparent, accountable community organization that actually served its purpose. As I tucked Jack into bed that night, he asked me a question that had become familiar over the past few years. "Daddy, tell me again about the HOA meeting." I smiled and settled into the chair beside his bed. "Well, buddy, it all started when we found out that some people who were supposed to be helping our neighborhood were actually stealing money." He knew the story by heart, but he never got tired of hearing it. The dramatic confrontation, the investigation, the trial, the happy ending where the bad guys went to jail and the community got better. It was a simple narrative, almost too neat, but it was fundamentally true. And as I told the story again, watching my son's eyes grow heavy with sleep, I felt grateful for the experience despite all the stress and drama. We'd learned important lessons about civic engagement, community organization, and the importance of holding leaders accountable. We'd seen that justice was possible, that corruption could be defeated, and that ordinary people had more power than they realized. The Seguero Vista HOA scandal had turned an annual meeting into a full uprising, exposed massive financial fraud, and led to criminal convictions and real reform. It was a story of greed and betrayal, but also of community solidarity and the triumph of accountability over corruption. And now it was part of our family history, a reminder that standing up for what's right matters, even when it's hard, even when it's complicated, even when all you're fighting about is HOA dues and landscaping contracts. Because in the end, it wasn't really about the money or the meetings, or even the satisfaction of seeing Sharon Whitmore led away in handcuffs. It was about proving that people could come together, demand better, and actually make change happen. That was the real victory. The lasting legacy of that chaotic Friday night when 300 angry homeowners decided they'd had enough. And that, I thought as I turned off Jack's light and headed downstairs, was a lesson worth learning.